If you thought that Republicans were going to fully repeal Obamacare, guess again, Riddler. Back we go to the delightful Kevin Williamson, who just has a flair for reality checks for Trumplicans that they just don't want to hear. But hey, it's indisputable. It is the facts, ladies and gentlemen. And we start out. I mean, here we start with the very first sentence. The lead in, as it's called in the blogging business. We have mandates because we want pre-existing conditions coverage. You can't have one without the other. Republicans have begun the process of repealing the grievously misnamed and soon to be unlamented, well, I call it the Unaffordable Care Act. I kind of like truth in advertising. Through the process of budget reconciliation, a parliamentary maneuver the Democrats had threatened to use to pass the Unaffordable Care Act over minority Republican opposition. Now, in the end, it was not needed, though significant changes to the law were made via subsequent reconciliation bills. As with Barack Obama's pen and phone aggrandizement of presidential power, the Senate Democrats' weakening of the filibuster, Chucky Schumer's party is going to regret a great deal of what Harry Greed's party did. It is not the case, as Democrats insist, that Republicans are simply repealing Obamacare without having given sufficient thought to what ought to replace it. Congressional Republicans finally seem to have learned that their prior strategy, simply insisting that a set of incoherent policies causing a great deal of stress and uncertainty constituted the greatest healthcare system in the world and doing nothing more, was a mistake and a critical one. But there's a problem, you see. There are two big important pieces of the Unaffordable Care Act that will be of concern as Republicans go about replacing it. The first is the so-called individual mandate, which is actually not all that much of a mandate, but which theoretically requires the great majority of American adults to purchase a federally defined minimum level of health insurance. The second is the rule requiring that insurance companies cover pre-existing conditions, which mandates that U.S. insurance companies participate in the fantasy that we can insure against events that already have happened. In other words, it's turning them into welfare agencies. Classic state corporatist fascism, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the pre-existing coverage rule defies economic reality and also space-time reality, and hence is the naturally popular part of the law. The individual mandate is less popular because people don't like being told what to do by the government, especially if it costs them money. Well, you can see the obvious problem here. We have to have an individual mandate because we want a pre-existing coverage mandate. You can't have one without the other. Now, do you see why incoming HHS Oberfuhrer Tom Price wants to keep most of Obamacare's superstructure intact? The regulatory, ins and outs. If insurers have to pick up the expenses for everyone who shows up at their door with a lung cancer or HIV or severe diabetes, well, that has to be paid for. Remember Staffel? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And the only way to pay for it is a rule that requires everybody to have insurance. Otherwise, economic self-interest ensures that most people have no reason to pay for insurance until they become sick, meaning that they pay no premiums until they have expenses that will far exceed them. An insurance market made up exclusively of sick people is financially unstable. Hence the term insurance. I mean, insurance is paying for what actuaries assess is your risk given your age and other demographic characteristics and the cost associated with it, and that's what you pay in your premiums, depending on your level of coverage. You are hedging against the future by paying for, in essence, paying for the likely level of your care over your estimated remaining life. That's insurance. Pre-existing conditions, a pre-existing condition mandate is essentially retroactive coverage, which means it turns private companies into welfare agencies. Now, if that's what you want, well, then call it that. Don't call it insurance. Now, together, the individual mandate and the pre-existing coverage rule make up the basic policy architecture of ObamaCare, the architecture that incoming HHS Secretary Tom Price wants to keep in place. There isn't a feasible way to have the popular pre-existing conditions coverage without the unpopular mandate. It's financially unsustainable. Look at the past 3 bleeping years. In fact, in order to make the system work, we would need to put some more teeth into that mandate. Because the penalties associated with it are very mild, many people, disproportionately young and healthy, not surprisingly, prefer to pay the fine, which is much more affordable, than to pay a great deal more for insurance, which is not. Hence, the pool of newly insured people under Obamacare has been much sicker than insurance companies. Did they really not expect that? If they didn't, then they drank the Kool-Aid. And of course, that has them squealing because they, why big insurance carriers went along with it? Because, well, they were being guaranteed a huge new revenue stream, which didn't materialize. How can people be in charge of huge companies that don't and not understand the first thing about economics and human nature? And more than that, it has them pulling out of Obamacare cartels around the country, leaving consumers with fewer choices and much higher premiums than they had been promised. This is known as bending the cost curve downward. Now, if you want to keep the existing pre-coverage rule, and Republicans say they do, which tells you they're not really serious about repealing Obamacare, then you are going to end up with Obamacare, or at least a version of it, which will be called, ta-da, TrumpCare, because it's the same damned thing. Remember how when in the vote in the House and in the Senate on the Unaffordable Care Act, there wasn't a single Republican vote for it, and all this time, last what is it now, up to 6 years, 3 of it after it actually took effect, there were no Republican fingerprints on it at all. Well, this is where the Republican fingerprints are going to be put on it. This is where it's going to become bipartisan, ladies and gentlemen. Trumplicans. I'm going to be calling it TrumpCare going forward, because this is where Republican fingerprints are going to be affixed to Obamacare, and it will become TrumpCare. I mean, it might be a slightly better or slightly worse version, but this is what you will have. There are a few ideas for finessing that problem away, such as creating a series of high-risk pools or a single federal high-risk pool for sick people seeking health insurance. Now, what this means in practice, you always got to distinguish between theory and practice, because theory is, well, this is what we think might happen, and practice is what actually happens. What's actually likely to happen, politically speaking. is that the sick people without insurance who want it would go into a separate insurance pool full of other people likely to require lots of expensive medical care. Naturally, the premiums in this market would be much higher than in the regular market, meaning that state governments and the federal government would be expected to subsidize them heavily, lest sick people be entirely priced out of the market, and we're right back where we started. But this creates the same moral hazard as the familiar ObamaCare system, now TrumpCare system. Why not just wait until you are sick to buy insurance if government is picking up the economic penalty for being in the high-risk pool? Good question, huh? Fair question. The way to cut this Gordian knot is to treat insurance like insurance. Remember, I defined it for you all above. Insurance is not a way to prepay for health care, though we insist on treating it as though it is. Properly understood, insurance is not a health care product at all. It is a financial product, the purpose of which is to mitigate the risk of incurring large and unexpected costs. Whether that is damage to an automobile, your car insurance does not pay for oil changes, for example, or healthcare costs. It is necessarily prospective, which is to say forward-looking, hence the aforementioned actuaries. No one can say whether you'll have a heart attack tomorrow or get brain cancer in 20 years, though our actuaries are really very good at determining how many people out of each million will have a problem like that in any given year and what it will cost to treat them. I mean, they don't know exactly who in a given group of 1 million people will suffer these infirmities, but they know that some percentage will. But we insist on trying to bend insurance into a retrospective product, as though it were possible to play the odds on something that has already happened. So long as we try to push off the obligation for paying for pre-existing conditions onto financial firms, which is what insurance companies are, and turning them into welfare agencies, we are simply using those companies to launder healthcare benefits that are in reality publicly financed in part or in total. You know, it would make much more sense to do the opposite of what the pollsters would advise. Keep the unpopular mandate, strengthen it even, and do away with the popular pre-existing conditions rule, replacing it with stronger regulation protecting people with insurance from losing their coverage once they become sick or grow old. For the people without coverage, well, Medicaid sucks, but in a reformed version, it is the most obvious solution, a way to pay directly for health care services rather than paying insurance companies to pay for services, as though putting a financial middleman in the equation were going to improve things. Ultimately, healthcare reform that treats insurance as insurance means that Americans will simply pay out of pocket for most of their medical needs, prescriptions and such, with insurance in most cases picking up the cost of catastrophic accidents and illnesses. Empowering consumers to do this means creating a real market with real prices, which simply does not exist now and hasn't for decades. I mean, try getting 3 competing quotes on a 2017 Honda Civic and then do the same with an appendectomy and see which market has real prices. That will be a long and difficult reform project, one that will not be achieved through a single piece of legislation or indeed through legislation alone. I mean, the bottom line is good healthcare reform is not going to be popular, which is why we've never had good healthcare reform. Because paying bills is not popular. But so long as we are trying to pass the bill on to someone else, healthcare will remain a mess.